The wind came in sharp from the north that morning, riding low and steady over the land like a whisper made of knives. Rhett Calder stood on his porch, coat unbuttoned, mug of black coffee gone cold in his hands. From that spot he could see, near to the edge of the fence line, where the cottonwoods stood like brittle bones, stripped bare of leaf or mercy. That's when he saw them. A broken-down wagon, sagging on one side, tilted like it had been dragged by a dying mule. No horses. No gear. Just two figures curled beneath it, one small, upright, the other slumped like a sack of bones against the wooden wheel. For a long while, he didn't move. He just stared. The girl stood up slowly. Her hair was matted. She was barefoot in the frost. A rust-colored smear ran from her cheek to her chin. She held something balled in her fist. A crumpled bit of cloth or bread. He couldn't tell. She stepped through the snow like it didn't know her. Walked straight up the long dirt drive. Her little shoulders squared. When she reached the porch, she didn't cry, didn't beg. "Sir," she said, her voice small but steady. She can't beg anymore. That was it. No name, no story, no pleas, just truth. Rhett didn't answer. He looked past the girl, toward the figure slumped under the wagon, a woman, still as winter, wrapped in what looked like a wedding dress. Turned burial, shroud lace fraying, hem torn, fabric clinging to her like it had forgotten what warmth felt like. Rhett swallowed the lump that always rose in his throat when memories crept in too fast. 6 winters ago, he'd watched the fever take his daughter, then the fire took his wife. Some losses don't bleed loud. They just carve you quiet. "Bring her," he said finally, setting the coffee down on the rail. He walked stiffly toward the barn, boots cracking the frost. The girl didn't speak again. She turned and ran, faster than he expected on bare feet. Rhett pulled open the barn door's old pine that groaned like a man waking from bad sleep. Inside, dust shimmered in slats of pale light, falling on hay and tools and time itself. "Die," he cleared. A pile of straw near the back wall, close to where the goats used to sleep before coyotes made the fence line a joke. By the time the girl dragged the woman's arm over her shoulder, she was wheezing. Rhett crossed the yard and took the woman into his arms. She was feather-light, skin waxy cold, and yet there was a weight to her like she carried stories too heavy to name. She never opened her eyes, never stirred. He placed her down gently. On the straw, unbuttoned his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She didn't flinch, didn't curl up or lean in, just stayed still. The girl knelt beside her, pressing her little body to her mother's. Whispering something that sounded like a song or maybe just a memory, Rhett backed out of the barn without a word, pulling the doors shut behind him. That creak, that slow, aching groan of old wood echoed in his chest. Like something trying to speak for the first time in years, he stood there in the wind, jaw clenched. Unsure if what he'd done was kindness or mistake. The snow began to fall again, slow and quiet. The woman's wedding dress had left a trail. In the snow-ragged, dragging like a ghost crawling home to die, Rhett looked at it for a long while, then kicked snow over it, scattering the shape until it vanished. The snow didn't let up. It thickened overnight, settling across the plains like a hush, turning every brittle fence post and bone-dry wheelbarrow into part of the same quiet graveyard. Rhett sat alone by the hearth, a log hissing slow behind. The flames. The coffee had gone bitter in the pot. He didn't drink it. His eyes stayed fixed on the photo above the mantel edges curling, colors faded to the color of old parchment. His wife had worn her braids tight, with a ribbon in each. His daughter Clara always wanted hers loose. Said the snow danced better when her hair did too. That had been 6 winters back, but grief wasn't a calendar thing. It lived in the cracks of floorboards and the sound of a kettle left on too long. He hadn't heard a voice in this house for weeks before the girl arrived. Uni, she'd said her name was, brave for her size, talkative even when it wasn't asked of her. She spoke with a certain clever rhythm, like she knew adults listened. More when you didn't beg. She's still real tired. She'd said that morning when he brought a folded blanket to the barn. Mama don't talk much, but she's smart. Reads lips too. Delia, that was her name. No last name offered. No story volunteered. Just the weight of her silence, thicker than the snow gathering on the barn's roof. At night, Rhett didn't sleep much. He sat near the window with the oil lamp turned low, listening. The wind howled some nights like it missed someone. Other nights, he heard her. Not words, just the soft sound of humming, gentle, mournful lullabies. Songs meant for babies, sung by someone who had run out of lullabies long before. Uni talked. More, loud enough for her mother to hear, soft enough to pretend it was only for herself. She told stories about the house with the green door that burned down, about the man who used to hand her pretty coins before he slapped her mother. She didn't cry when she said it, just stated it like a weather report. Fire took the chickens to Uni, added one night through the barn wall. Ma said, "We can still have eggs and dreams." Rhett couldn't answer. He just listened. Forehead pressed to the cool timber. The next morning, he brought out his old tools. They'd sat rusting in the shed behind the cabin. Wrenches, sharpening stones, an old axe he hadn't touched since the year after Clara. He set them on the workbench, ran his thumb over the blades. One by one, he cleaned them, ran the whetstones slow and steady until each edge caught the gray light and whispered of use. The rasping sound echoed through the yard, sharp and rhythmic. It felt like breathing for the first time in too long. Something about the motion made his chest ache in a way that wasn't pain but memory. He left coffee and bread at the barn. Door before dusk. Steam rose from the tin cup, bread still warm from the stove. No footsteps followed him. He didn't turn around. Later, when he peeked through a slat in the barn wall, he saw Uni take the bread first. She nibbled a corner, eyes on her mother. Only after a long pause did Delia reach for it. That night, Uni wandered toward the cabin with a blanket around her shoulders. Rhett opened the door before she could knock. "I won't stay," she said quickly. "Just wanted to ask something." He nodded once. "What happened to your girl?" she asked. He could have lied. Said she left for school. Said she married someone rich out in Carson City. But Uni didn't strike him as a child who'd believe in that kind of easy. "She loved the snow," he said. That was all. Uni looked out at the white landscape, where the moon had turned. The drifts into gentle waves of silver. "Mama used to?" Before fire made her afraid of light, Rhett said nothing. "She still hums to it, though," Uni added, turning to go. "Like it's the only thing listening." When the barn doors closed again, Rhett looked down at his hands. The dirt under his nails, the tiny nick on his thumb from sharpening the axe. They were still hands meant for something. Maybe not comfort, but maybe shelter. That was something. The wind rattled the shutters just once, as if agreeing. I added another log to the fire and sat back in the chair that still rocked when no one touched it. The wind came down from the ridge like a curse, sweeping snow across the plains in thick, blinding waves.
"Oh, baby."
Rhett heard it in the stovepipe first, a low groan that turned shrill, rattling like bones in a barrel. He stood from the table before the coffee even stopped steaming. By the time he reached the barn, the sky had turned white, and the world shrank to what little he could see through the storm. He threw the doors open against the wind. The scent inside was sharp, cold straw, damp, cloth, and something sour beneath it. Uni looked up from where she knelt. "She won't wake," she said, voice small. Delia was slumped against the hay pile, her skin pale and slick with sweat. One arm limp across her lap, the other curled weakly against her chest. She didn't stir when Rhett knelt beside her. "She was breathing heavy this morning," Uni whispered. "Now it's like she's forgetting how." Rhett didn't hesitate. He peeled off his coat, wrapped it around Delia, and lifted her. She weighed next to nothing. Her head lolled against his chest. Uni followed close behind, holding a ragged scrap of cloth with button eyes and a threadbare dress, a stuffed thing stitched from old clothes. She called it Little Bit. She held it like it might breathe, too. Inside the house, Rhett cleared the cot beneath the front window. It had sat unused since the fire. His wife had made it up the morning she died, a quilt half-folded pillow. Fluffed, he never had the heart to move it. Now Delia lay there, her breath shallow and hot against the cold air. Rhett worked without speaking. He lit the stove higher, filled a kettle, and crushed dried herbs into a chipped blue mug, mint willow bark, and the last of the chamomile. He spooned water to her lips, but most of it dribbled down her chin. Uni wiped it away with the hem of her sleeve. She doesn't like tea, she said softly. She like waking up more, Rhett answered. The storm rattled the walls. Snow blew sideways across the window, making the panes shudder. Uni curled beside the cot, still holding a little bit, her head resting on her mother's knee. At night, Rhett didn't sleep in the chair. He sat near the fire, boots off, coat drying by the hearth. His eyes burned from the heat, but he kept watching the cot. In the deep hours, with the storm howling outside and the fire grown low, sleep finally found him. He dreamt of braids. His wife sat on the porch, weaving Clara's hair, her fingers, quick and practiced. Snowflakes drifted down like feathers. Clara laughed and twisted away, her breath steaming in the morning light. The sound of her joy was enough to crack something wide in his chest. He woke with a start. The fire was still burning, low but steady. Delia's hand had moved. One thin hand now rested on top of Uni's tangled curls. Her fingers twitched, then curled slightly, protective. Her face still looked gaunt, but her color had returned, a faint flush on her cheeks, a sheen of sweat cooling. Then her eyes opened, just a little. They found Rhett, and though she said nothing, didn't flinch. The way her gaze held his said everything. Not fear, not thanks. Something quieter, recognition, like she remembered something. She hadn't known she'd forgotten, that there were still hands in this world that didn't take. The fire flickered just then, rising brighter for half a moment, casting their shadows across the log wall. Rhett stood slowly. He stepped into the kitchen and filled the kettle again. Uni didn't say anything. She just held her mother's hand tighter and leaned in closer, a little bit tucked beneath her chin. Outside, the storm raged on, merciless and wild. Inside, 3 hearts beat to the same quiet rhythm. One house, one roof, one fire between them. Delia moved through the house like she wasn't sure the floor would hold her weight. She never made a sound entering or leaving a room, never touched a door without first glancing at Rhett to make sure it wasn't forbidden. She still hadn't said a word, but her hand spoke plenty. One morning, Rhett found the old flannel shirt he used for chopping wood folded neatly on the back of the rocking chair. The tear along the shoulder seam, one that had been there for 2 winters, was stitched closed in careful thread, not showy, not fancy. Just enough to say, someone still sees the small things. He wore it that same day, though he hadn't worn it in months. It felt like wearing something that had learned to forgive. Delia swept the hearth, scrubbed the old kettle, washed the linens in silence. She never asked permission. But she always watched Rhett out of the corner of her eye, like she expected the next second to be one of punishment. Rhett didn't speak to her much, not out of coldness, just out of knowing. You can't thaw fear with too many words. Sometimes quiet is the safest room. Jenna filled those silences. She brought him little things, dandelions pressed in pages of a brittle Bible, a feather she found that reminded her of a story her mother once told. She asked questions, too, about the mule, about the barn, about why coffee smelled better. Then it tasted, one morning, after Rhett showed her how to crank the grinder and pour the beans into the tin cup just right, she looked up and asked, "Was Mama ever sold?" Rhett didn't answer. He looked out the window at the frost melting slow on the railing. His throat caught on something sharp. He said nothing. Juna didn't push. She just nodded like she understood. And in a way, maybe she did. The days crept by in a fragile kind of rhythm. The storm passed. The winds calmed. But trust, that was its own kind of weather. It didn't change because the sky did. Delia began to warm slightly. Not in words, but in the way she poured Rhett's coffee in the morning when he'd forgotten. 2. In how she folded the blanket he left crumpled on the rocking chair. In how she dared to look into the fire now, not just past it. Still, she never spoke. Rhett never asked her to. Then one afternoon, the sound of hooves cracked the stillness. A rider came up the ridge, Henry Brecker, from the north side of the county. He reined in near the well, his face flushed from the ride. Rhett met him halfway down the trail, eyes narrow against the light. "Snow's melting fast," Henry said.
Yes.
Spring's thinking about showing its face. Rhett nodded. Maybe. Henry leaned in. You ain't seen a woman and child come through, have you? Word is a preacher's wagon was robbed down by the borderlands. Took his money, horse, and his wife, though folks say she never wore the ring by choice. Rhett didn't flinch. Haven't seen a soul but crows and mule deer. Henry studied him for a beat too long, then grunted. Well, if you do, might be best to keep your head low. Some of those preacher folk don't take kindly to being shamed in public. Man, like that'll ride till he finds what's his. Rhett just looked past him, into the trees. Ain't nothing his up here. Henry spat in the dirt, tipped his hat, turned his horse without another word. Rhett waited until the rider disappeared behind the hill before walking back up the trail. His boots crunched the thawing earth. He stepped onto the porch and stopped. Delia stood in the doorway. Her eyes met his. Not long, not deep. But it was the first time. Not fear, not thanks. Something else, the kind of look that didn't beg or apologize, just said, I know what you did. I see it. Rhett nodded once and stepped past her into the house. That night, he found the flannel shirt hanging near the stove again, freshly mended where he'd torn it on a nail that morning. The same careful thread. The same quiet proof that someone still believed in repairing what could be saved. The first time Delia spoke, her voice barely rose above the crackle of the fire. My name, she said, while folding the last of the linens, is Delia Grace. Rhett looked up from the stove but didn't say a word. She didn't need prompting. Stood there for a long moment, her hands smoothing over the fabric like she was ironing memories into the folds. The man who took us in said he was a preacher, wasn't one. He traded promises like buttons. Said if I couldn't bear him a son, I wasn't fit for anything but trade. Sold me for a sack of grain and a wheel of salt pork. Her voice cracked like dry timber. We ran the first time he passed out drunk. With the fire still lit, she didn't cry. Just looked out the window where the snow had melted to slush, and the wind moved gentler now through the cottonwoods. Rhett poured coffee into 2 mugs and offered her one. She hesitated, then took it. Her fingers brushed his. They sat across from each other at the table, the fire painting soft gold on the walls. Juna slept curled like a kitten in the old rocking chair, one hand still clutching a little bit. Her breathing was deep and slow. Delia sipped the coffee, then blinked at the bitterness. I forgot how real things taste. That night, Rhett went to the cedar trunk at the foot of his bed and opened it for the first time in years. Folded on top was his wife's shawl, thick wool, dyed a dusky red, still faintly smelling of rosemary and smoke. He brought it to Delia without a word. When she took it in her hands, she didn't ask whose it was. She held it to her cheek, closed her eyes, and whispered something he didn't quite catch. But it sounded like a prayer. Days passed gently, soft steps, shared chores, quiet laughter, the kind of peace that grows not from absence of pain, but presence of grace. One evening, Rhett stood by the barn door, watching the ridge for coyotes. He brought his rifle with him. Delia stepped out onto the porch. He handed it to her. For coyotes, he said. She took it without flinching, her fingers wrapped around the stock. She raised it clumsy at first, then steadied. Ah! Rhett stepped. Behind her, guiding her aim, when she lowered it, her mouth didn't smile, but her eyes did. I hope I never have to shoot anything again, she murmured. Then let's teach the land you're not afraid to. Later inside, Delia lit the fire while Uni sorted buttons into a tin. She hummed softly the same lullaby Rhett had once heard through the barn wall. Joni asked, Can I have a braid tonight, Mama? Delia nodded and sat her daughter on the rug. She combed her fingers through the girl's wild curls, slowly weaving them into a single braid. Firelight caught in the strands. Then, as if unsure whether the world would allow it, she turned and held the brush out to Rhett. He hesitated. His hands were calloused, clumsy. He took the brush anyway. Kneeling beside Uni, he tried. His fingers fumbled, but he remembered. His wife used to hum while braiding Clara's hair, and he had watched, had learned without knowing he was learning. Delia watched him. Her eyes were soft, glassy, but not broken. There between them, child, brush, fire, something passed. Without words, not romance, not promise, something quieter, a truth shared. We have all lost. And we are all still here. He tied the braid with a frayed ribbon. Jenna yawned and leaned against him. Delia's hand grazed his, not by accident. Not quite on purpose either. They sat in silence. Firelight dancing on the walls. Shadows curled around them like warmth. The shawl draped over Delia's shoulders. The rifle stood by the door, and for the first time in years, Rhett didn't hear. Ghosts in the crackling fire, only the sound of something beginning. The preacher came just after dawn. The wind had calmed, but the air still bit like it hadn't forgotten what winter meant. Rhett stood on the porch in his mended flannel, rifle across his arms. He'd been expecting this. Some men don't let go of what they think they own, even when it's walked away from them. 2 riders flanked the preacher. Younger men, hard eyes, guns at their hips. Delia stood just inside the doorway. Uni clung to Rhett's pant leg, her breath small and shallow against the cold. The preacher didn't smile. "You've got something that ain't yours," he said, voice sharp and clean like a blade. She was bought fair, contract drawn in blood, and signed before the Lord. Rhett didn't flinch, stared down the man like he was sizing up rot in a fence post. "This here's a place for mending fences and feeding stock," Rhett said, "not selling women." One of the men beside the preacher shifted in his saddle. His hand brushed his gun. "I'm not looking for trouble," the preacher said. "I'm looking for what's mine." Rhett stepped forward, slow, calm. "She ain't yours," he said. "And you'll find no preacher in this county willing to bless your kind of lie." Delia stepped out onto the porch. No shawl, no rifle, just her presence quiet, unshaken. Rhett didn't take his eyes off the preacher. He shifted the rifle, then lowered it just enough to fire into the dirt at their horses' feet. The shot echoed like thunder across the still morning. The preacher's horse reared. One of the younger men cursed.
Ow.
The preacher gritted his teeth, spit in the dirt, and jerked his reins. "Y'all regret this," he muttered. But he didn't draw. He didn't dare. They turned. The 3 of them rode off down the ridge, dust trailing behind them like the last breath of a dying lie. Rhett stood still until the hooves faded into silence. Delia moved beside him and rested her hand on his arm. Not for comfort, not out of fear, just to say I was never going back. Later that day, Rhett hitched up the wagon. Delia brushed Yuna's hair and placed a fresh braid down her back, tying it with a clean white ribbon. The girl giggled and asked if she could sit up front. "You'll freeze," Rhett warned. Jaina only smiled and climbed in beside him. Delia joined them, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her hand found Rhett's without searching. They didn't ride into town to hide. They rode to be seen. The townsfolk paused when the wagon rolled in. Boots stopped mid-step. Voices hushed. Eyes followed. Rhett stepped down and helped Delia out, walked her to the general store. Uni hopping behind them like the slush underfoot was spring grass. Inside, he nodded to the shopkeep. "This here's my family now?" Delia didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her chin was high. Her braid rested proud on her back. And in her silence was more truth than most men ever learned to say. Jaina beamed and pointed at the jars of peppermint sticks in the corner. The shopkeep smiled and handed her 2. No one argued. No one whispered. The town saw what had happened, not the fight, but the aftermath. And it was enough. On the ride home, snow began to fall, soft, slow flakes. Not like the blizzards from before, just a quiet reminder that the world still turned even after justice had been served. Rhett let the reins hang loose. Delia leaned her head against his shoulder. Uni sang something out of tune and out of time, and no one corrected her. When they reached the ranch, the barn door swayed gently in the wind. Inside, the rocking chair waited. It hadn't moved in years, not since Rhett stopped believing it ever would again. That night, Delia sat in it, shawl tucked around her knees, Uni curled in her lap. Rhett brewed coffee and placed it by her hand. She rocked, not fast, not slow. just enough to remind the house it had a heartbeat again. Outside, snow kept falling, but inside, it didn't matter, because some winters end not with warmth, but with welcome. And some reckonings don't come with vengeance, they come with stillness and love. Real love sometimes arrives, not like thunder, but like a braid in a child's hair, or a woman choosing not to run.